Our poet, Chaim Bialik, writes, Acharei moti, sifdu kachali, hayayish, or Emanu-El. After my death, thus shall you mourn for me. Say there was a man, and behold, he is no more. Before his time did this man die, and the song of his life was interrupted in the middle. And woe, he had yet one more song, and now that song is lost forever. How sad. He had a lute, a living, feeling soul, and when he plucked its strings, all the secrets of his heart did he reveal, and with all its strings did he speak, but yet one more secret was hidden. With haste did his hands pluck, yet one more melody remained within it, and remains unrevealed till today. And great, very great is the hurt. There was a man, and behold, he is no more. The song of his life was interrupted in the middle. One more song he had within himself, and now that song is lost forever. This past Monday, knowing that time was short, a group of us gathered around Rick. His eyes were closed, and he was breathing comfortably. We were there to give Rick our final blessing. Nancy, his beloved wife of 43 years, gently ran her fingers through his hair. His cousins, Brian and Brooke, gently touched his shoulder, while the rest of us placed our hands on our good friend as we said goodbye. We began with prayers, our voices holding Rick, lifting him, comforting him, and one another. Slowly, gently, we said the final vidui, bringing for Rick a sense of shalem and shalom, wholeness and peace. Each of us in turn spoke aloud to Rick with a faith that even in those final moments, he would hear us, that our love and our memories and our respect for him would come through. And perhaps that would ease his transition from life, knowing that he was important to us, that he was loved, and that his life had affected so many in ways so profound. Following Jewish tradition, we each washed his feet and lit a candle which flickered like a soul ready to depart. Nancy told Rick that it was okay to let go now, that he didn't have to keep fighting, and that they had lived an amazing life together. Then, one last time, We sang to Rick, and we cried. An hour later, knowing that he was truly loved, Rick gently passed. Judaism says that God formed us from dust and breathed into us a neshama, the soul of life. Like a wave returns to the ocean, so too our souls return to God. We mourn today because Rick has gone back to the source, and he will be so very missed. Richard David Shapiro was born the last day of Hanukkah, December 24th, 1951, in Brooklyn. And he died this past Monday, April 3rd, here in Atlanta. The corresponding Hebrew dates are the Kislev 24:57:12 and the 12th of Nisan, 5783. He was 71 years old. Rick was raised in Phoenix, the son of Selma and Lenny Zikaron Lebracha. He was beloved husband to Nancy and father to Lori and Jeff. He was cousin to Robin, as well as Brian and Brooke and their little children, Mila and Jordan. Rick was a good friend to many. This was extremely important because to Rick, friends were family. Rick was a good son, even when that was a hard thing to do. He especially admired his father, Lenny, who taught Rick how to be both a realist and an optimist. For Rick saw things for how they really were with open eyes. And he was also eager to see the good in people and the humor in any situation. Rick shared stories from when he was a teenager, working summers on the cantaloupe farm in Central California that his dad helped run. Rick had good friends there, and we can imagine him working long days with his buddies, living in the barracks, and spending that type of pure, uncomplicated time with his father. Rick really looked forward to it. The only side effect was that after a few summers working on the farm, for the next 50 years, Rick wouldn't touch or even look at a cantaloupe, or really any melon. Rick was a self-made man. No one ever gave him anything, and he worked hard to achieve his accomplishments. He had a job all through high school, and then went to ASU, where he learned to love the Sun Devils and continued his lifelong passion for all things sports, especially baseball and the San Francisco Giants. Out of college, Rick's first job was in Southern California. Nancy was there at the same time doing her residency. They met at a Jewish singles event in Encino. Nancy tells it that they were both dragged there by friends. Neither really wanted to go, but that night changed their lives. You can picture the scene, music playing, people having drinks, some folks on the dance floor, others talking in the corner. At one end of the venue, there were tables set up with board games, and Nancy sat down across from Rick for a friendly get-to-know-you game of backgammon. When Nancy told me about the game, she laughed out loud as she recalled all the choice words she let loose as the game got away from her. But Nancy, despite your colorful language, or maybe because of it, you and Rick liked each other. So when he called you on the telephone to ask you out, you were glad to say yes. Over the next few months, as you got to know one another, it was quickly apparent that this relationship was serious and that you were both in love. It makes me smile to think of Rick, whose apartment was close to yours, Nancy, picking flowers out of people's gardens on his morning run and then leaving them on your doorstep for you to find as you started your day. Such a romantic. And he did this several times a week. I also love picturing Rick running down the street with flowers in his hand, eager to make you smile and think of him even when he wasn't here. Nancy, when you opened your door that first morning and saw a rose, did you somehow know that you and Rick would fall in love, create a home and a family, that you'd travel together, grow together, play together, and adventure through life together as Besheret, soulmates? I wonder if you could have known, Nancy, when you opened the door that first morning, the LA sun shining on your face, seeing that reminder of Rick's love for you, could you have known that he'd be your husband and you his wife, and together have something so sublime? We have a word for this, Nancy, this type of life lived, this type of love shared. Kadosh, sacred, holy. Rick loved you with all his heart, and you loved him back just as fiercely. For Rick, you were first. And I know that for most of his life, Lori and Jeff were also number one. But people are complicated, and things don't always turn out the way that we would want or the way that they should. That's how Rick explained it to me anyway. When I think of Rick, I think of how much he loved the Jewish people and Israel and Temple Emanu-El. The Jewish community was a huge part of his life. It worked for him so well because he cared so deeply and because he was such a social and likable guy. He loved the guys from the book club and his basketball crew. He was close with a gang from softball, and he adored his close friends from the Chavarah. He helped lead the efforts for life and legacy to ensure that Temple Emanu-El's future was secure long after every one of us has left this earth. And Rick was president of our synagogue, which is a really big deal. Rick devoted years of his life to generations of Jews, some here today, others who have not yet been born. Rick led this congregation, the place where so many will learn and strive, help and heal, celebrate and be supported. Rick's life helped steer the tremendous and resounding good that emanates from this place. the Torah that continues to ripple forward and echo back to us again and again and again. Immortality is not through a name or an image, but rather it is achieved solely through the deeds that we do and through the people with whom we deeply connect. Rick did that. I knew Rick well as his rabbi and as his friend. We spent a lot of time together. I knew his struggles and his joys, and he knew mine. When times were tough for Rick, especially this past year, he'd ask about my kids and their sports and their friends. I think that he would have been touched to know that when he passed away, my whole family cried. Rick, my friend, your song was cut too short, too soon, and that's not fair. Our only comfort is that you lived a really good life, one with vibrancy and zest, one of passion and laughter. In your life, you made your mark. You were respected, and you were very loved. So too in death will you be very, very missed. May your memory be a blessing, always. Zikaron lebracha. I'd like to call up, to begin with, two friends, Bob Anton and Art Katz, to say some words. God, you go first.
Morning.
I have you step nice and close.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. This is a very difficult time for all of us, and I've got my wife here. She's probably going to have to carry me through on this one. When Rick asked me a few weeks ago if I would feel comfortable in saying a eulogy about him, I was somewhat caught off guard. I hesitated at first. Not that I did not want to prepare one and speak to all of you about him, but the actual realization that our good friend Rick Shapiro would no longer be with us. Of course, I told him I would honor him, as I believe he would have done the same for me. Our families joined Temple Emanu-El in 1989. With children the same age, we had a lot in common. I got to know Rick a lot better when we were on the Temple Emanu-El softball team. As we all know, Rick was a very good athlete and was a starter on the team. However, our captain was extremely competitive and only played the same guys each game. After the first couple of games of me not playing, I was discouraged. During the next game, Rick took himself out of the lineup and asked the captain to put Bob in to take his place in the outfield. I thought, wow, what a nice thing to do. At that moment, I did not realize that this would become our Casablanca moment when Humphrey Bogart's character, Rick, tells the police captain while descending into the dark, foggy night, ending Casablanca, saying, "Louis, I think this is the beginning of a beautiful friendship." That was over 34 years ago. I could always count on Rick, and I know he could count on me when needed. As Spike said, we spent a lot of time together talking about sports, listening to sports talk radio, watching sports, playing sports, agreeing and disagreeing on sports. Rick was a frequent visitor at the J. He always made the time to come up to me to see how things were going. We went to Falcon football and Braves baseball games, and even for a few years shared hockey tickets for the Atlanta Thrashers. Rick never understood why I stayed loyal to my hometown professional and college sports teams and did not convert to the Atlanta teams. As he often noted, "Bob, how long have you lived in Atlanta?" He even told me more than once, "Tell the last person leaving Pittsburgh to turn off the lights." He enjoyed telling me during the football season that his two favorite teams are the Falcons and anyone else who played Pittsburgh. I could have taken this the wrong way, and some people even told me you should have been insulted, but I knew that it was just Rick being Rick. Rick did admit he was somewhat envious that I was fortunate enough to experience several sports championships and that he would have liked to enjoy at least one championship for one of his teams. When I visited Rick recently, I saw the 3 San Francisco Giant World Series championship banners posted on his bedroom wall, so I know that he did get that wish to enjoy his championships. I think he may have worn that black Giants jacket for several weeks before he finally took it off, but good for him. Rick and Nancy hosted their annual Super Bowl party for many years for their Hover-Off friends, Rick's basketball team, networking club, and book club members. It was so obvious how much he enjoyed hosting the event and schmoozing with all of his friends, except for the 2017 Super Bowl year when the Falcons lost to the New England Patriots after giving up a big lead. I thought of teasing him with the 28-3 score at halftime, but I chose not to. I think he may have enjoyed the teasing, but, well, maybe not. But I did think Rick hit a home run when Rick and Nancy joined Temple Emanu-El. I watched Rick join the softball team, join Brotherhood, be a high holiday usher, and even the head usher who actually got to adjust the air conditioning units on the wall during the holidays, become Brotherhood president, be on the board, and finally the Temple Emanu-El president. When Rick spoke to the congregation during Friday night announcements and during the high holiday campaign drives, it was apparent he had the respect and admiration of the clergy and the whole congregation. Rick's commitment and loyalty to Temple Emanu-El was the true meaning when we referred to our Temple Emanu-El family. It certainly was his second home. Rick was a strong believer in giving back to the community and spoke about it often to me. He was involved in many volunteering groups, including projects through Temple Emanu-El, the Community Food Bank, the Dick Wilson Golf Tournament, Lecatech Community Action Center, the Honey Group, and several others. He made it a point to recruit others to become more involved and to volunteer. I was one of them and followed Rick in these endeavors and continue to this day to participate with several volunteering programs. Rick had a tough 2022 with the passing of his mother, Selma, losing his beloved pup, Snoops, and receiving the cancer diagnosis. It was a very bad break. I was fortunate to be able to spend time with Rick over the past year. He told me that when he accepted his condition, he felt that he had been able to accomplish and check off many things in life from his bucket list. He especially was pleased that him and Nancy got to visit all the countries and faraway places that they got to experience. Even when I visited him for the last time last week, when he was so very sick, he still asked me how my recent shoulder surgery was coming along. We were all concerned from the beginning of the diagnosis, but felt there was hope and some light at the end of the tunnel as we were following Rick's messages and Nancy's Caring Bridge updates. Rick did share with me how appreciative he was for the overwhelming, and he highlighted overwhelming, outpouring of love and prayers from all of his friends, associates, and congregants. As I end this eulogy, I know Rick will be greatly missed and never forgotten. I know I won't.
For those of you who I don't know, my name is Arthur Katz. Proud to say I was a very good friend of Rick's. Rick Shapiro. 4 key words during his last year: dignity, resolve, and my hero. I have my tissue. The year was 2017. Rick Shapiro was in the early stages of his 2-year term as Temple Emanu-El's co-president, having joined in partnership with me, the incumbent. Prior to that time, Carol and I knew Rick and Nancy through the years at Temple Emanu-El on a more casual basis. Synagogue co-presidencies change personal relationships. In this case, the change was a very, very positive one. Rick came into an absolute buzzsaw of positive activity here at Temple Emanu-El, with challenges popping up every day. He didn't miss a beat, and we quickly became true partners. As I'm sure you can readily surmise, Rick and I were in daily contact, frequently in person, and we really got to know one another in deep, very meaningful ways. Rick got up to speed very quickly and wrapped his arms around all the moving parts that are involved in a synagogue's operations. When my term ended, Rick kept Temple Emanu-El's positive momentum without missing a beat through the rest of his tenure. When the Grinspool Foundation offered an incentivized opportunity to start a Life and Legacy program, Rick and I saw a potential great benefit to Temple Emanu-El, and we stepped up. Whatever that incentive was, each and every year, we exceeded whatever the required goal was, and we were very proud of it. The program was and is a resounding success as our partnership continued, even through a good part of his battle with cancer. All of this brought us and our spouses into a strong two-couple friendship. During some of this time, Carol, my wife, was hospitalized and then went through a 6-month-plus recuperation at home. Rick and Nancy visited, and Rick also even came by in the evenings after a basketball game at the J. Speaking of basketball, sports and athletics were also a very big part of who Rick was. He was a runner. He completed several marathons. He was a hiker, a golfer, a Temple Emanu-El softball player, a baseball sports enthusiastic, and much more. He loved his travels with Nancy, and we talked travel not infrequently. Next to his love for Nancy was his love for Snoops, his beagle buddy. Since Rick worked his business from a home office, he walked Snoops a lot. I probably had more conversations with Rick while he was walking Snoops than any other. And as co-presidents will sometimes disagree, there were many times when I asked him to put Snoops on the phone. And of course, there was his commitment to the San Francisco Giants, as I'm sure you have heard and will hear more of. During a visit with Rick 2 weeks ago, he shared his joy and pride at having attended World Series games in San Francisco in both the 2010 and 2014 World Series. He was really proud that he made that trip and used up a lot of points. As you may have survived, all my comments thus far are related to how I got to know Rick really well. My remaining comments relate to the most recent 12 months. Rick was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, and he and Nancy decided that the way they would inform others was by communicating with a few close friends and having the word disseminate further through those friends. I received a call asking me to come to his house, and being a co-president, talked to him several times a day. I said, just tell me. And he said, no, please come to my house, which I did. His and Nancy's purpose was to inform me with dignity. His exact words were, and I quote, yesterday I was a healthy 70-year-old. Now I am a cancer patient. He did this with dignity and with resolve to pursue that healing. These two words, dignity and resolve, shone throughout the ensuing months. Within a short period of time, as we very frequently conversed, I found two corresponding words, my hero. And I told him so every time we talked or visited. The dignity and resolve Rick displayed, within and without, week in and week out, in dealing with the challenges of chemotherapy, radiation, surgery, and ongoing evaluations, never faltered. Rest in peace, my hero.
I'd like to call up three friends, Dick Rogan, Mark Miller, and Lynn Newport.
For as long as I can remember, Rick has been a part of my life. He's the brother I did not have. I can safely say that I've known Rick longer than anyone else in this room. Neither Rick or I can remember a time that we did not know each other. Thinking back, I'm pretty sure we met in the summer of 1954, although it might have been a year earlier. Rick's father, Lenny, and my father, Ben, were in the produce business, and our mothers, Selma and Lila, were native New Yorkers. It was a very good foundation for a lifelong friendship between two families. We were Mishpoka. Although Rick grew up in Phoenix and I grew up in Fresno, Rick's family would come to Fresno in the summertime so Lenny could work the summer melon season. Rick inherited much from Lenny: a good sense of humor, a fondness and a knack for finding good people, and a knack for summing up things with a catchy phrase, and of course a love of baseball. Although Rick did not share Brooklyn-born and raised Lenny's admiration of the hated Dodgers. Back then and even today, the Dodgers and the Giants were arch rivals, and of course you all know Rick was a diehard Giants fan, and I know why. Both Fresno and Phoenix in those days were Giants country, and every day we kids listened to the Giants on a transistor radio beside the swimming pool. The average 100-degree summer day in Fresno, and it's a dry heat, for 10-year-old boys is spent almost entirely in the swimming pool. We stayed in the pool until our mothers told us we were going to look like a sunburned prune if we didn't get out. We played baseball in the pool using a wiffle ball. The diving board was home plate. You hit a home run when you hit the ball over the fence. The produce buyers and their families congregated at a wonderful hotel called the Hacienda. It was no doubt the largest group of Jews in Fresno who did not own clothing stores. The Hacienda had 3 swimming pools, and it was our duty to sample each one every day. We loved the big Olympic-sized pool with its diving boards, but it was a special treat to jump into the mermaid pool, which featured a glass window that allowed observation from the hotel bar. Our antics were not nearly as artistic as the professional underwater ballerinas who put on a nightly show, which once in a great while we were allowed to watch. Rick and I went to summer camp together at Camp Sequoia in the nearby Sierra Nevada mountains. near Kings Canyon National Park. We learned together to row a boat, to paddle a canoe, and to sail a small sailboat. We hiked steep trails in those rugged mountains, and we camped overnight without tents under the stars. We fished. We marveled at the giant sequoia trees and held hands to see how many kids could go around the trunk. It's 25, by the way. We watched Sputnik pass overhead and saw shooting stars in the dark sky. We had great times together. I have fond memories of the two of us piling into the back seat of Lenny's Chrysler and heading out to the west side of the San Joaquin Valley where the melons are grown and packed. The car had a distinct aroma, a combination of cigar smoke and cantaloupes. Not easily forgotten. Once we were out at the packing sheds, while the adults were wheeling and dealing, we boys would occupy ourselves in many ways, such as putting a few of the cull melons on the railroad siding and watching with delight as the train cars squished them. I can't possibly recount all of our adventures, as there are nearly 70 years to cover. Rick and I remained close friends, even through high school and college, exchanging literally hundreds of letters and talking sports. When we were old enough to have our own cars, we would knock off our summer jobs at our respective packing sheds, hop in Rick's Camaro, which was a much nicer car than my '57 Ford, and head for Candlestick Park to see the Giants play. After college, we both moved to San Francisco and were roommates for a while. Rick met his beloved Nancy, and as they say, the rest is history. Ultimately, they settled in Atlanta, and I remained in the Bay Area. The distance made it difficult to see each other, but we stayed in touch, still then, mostly by letter, since those were the days of the 3-minute egg timer long-distance phone call. When I went through a rough patch in my life about 25 years ago, Rick guided me forward. At his urging, we met in Vancouver in wintertime, and we had a great time. He just called me up one day and said, "Come on, you're going." And so I went. We went snowshoeing. We took the ferry to Victoria. We wandered around the town, and let's just say, Rick was there for me, as always. Sorry. The funniest incident of that trip was when we discovered a Lush store, which looked very colorful and intriguing. So we wandered in and saw many pastel, fruity-looking things that we thought were there to sample. Rick, being more adventurous, took the first bite out of what we thought was a mango, and the large grin on his face quickly turned into a scowl when it turned out to be bubble bath soap. Later, Rick and Nancy came to visit and met my wife-to-be, Barb, who's here with me today, of course. Rick wanted to be sure I was on the right track. For one thing you know about Rick, he always had your back. I was relieved when he whispered in my ear, "She's a keeper," and she is. A little while later, Rick and Barb and Nancy and I met up again in Vancouver. We had another terrific time, including more snowshoeing and cross-country skiing in Whistler. Since then, we've enjoyed trips together, including Great Glacier National Park, Santa Fe and Taos, Norway, and Italy. These are some of the fondest memories we have. A trip with Rick was always an adventure. There was no time for sitting around. After climbing a few mountains near Santa Fe, we journeyed up to Taos to do some river rafting on the Rio Grande. Toward the end of that rafting trip, Rick and I jumped out of the raft and let the rushing river carry us downstream, bobbing off river rocks and bouncing along merrily. In Italy, the four of us rented a lovely farmhouse in the hills of Umbria and took hikes and day trips for a heavenly week. On our first day, we enjoyed a lovely hike to a nearby village and found the local restaurant. And there, in front of a massive wood-fired oven, Nana stood there ready to make our pizza, which we enjoyed outside, of course, under a grape arbor. This was a made-for-Hollywood script. It was unbelievable. Later, with Rick at the wheel, we motored our way through countless roundabouts in Umbria and Tuscany, and ultimately up to Venice, where we stayed in a 500-year-old apartment on the Grand Canal. We soon learned to pick up morning pastries and enjoy them with our coffees on the dock as we watched the world go by. Those of you who know Rick know that he does not usually just watch the world go by. He affects how it goes by. For me, Rick pushed me to do things I probably wouldn't have done. Rick will always be my brother, and I love him dearly. I had a wonderful visit with him just last week. 2 Altacockers sitting out on the back porch, enjoying each other. And I choose to remember all of the good times together. He made sure to tell me Nancy had been a trooper during all this illness that he had suffered. It was so sad. I choose to remember the good times together, jumping off the diving board after hitting the wiffle ball on a warm summer day, bobbing along the Rio Grande, snowshoeing in the mountains above Vancouver, going through Italy, walking along a trail, eating that wonderful pizza, and of course, watching our beloved Giants win 3 World Series in San Francisco, which we did together, and just loving every minute, laughing and joking all the way. For me, Rick will always be with me, and he'll always have my back.
Any good eulogy requires props. I'll get to those in a minute. My name is Mark Miller, and as Rick called me, I was known as his handyman and arborist. Rick and I first bonded when Rick and Nancy hosted a meet and greet at their house for the new rabbis, Rabbi Max and Rabbi Rachel. And we had spent some time just kind of talking and trying to find some common ground that we could agree on. Several weeks after that meet and greet, Rick sends me a text message saying, "Hey, how about doing lunch one day?" And I responded back, "Sure." So he gave me a date, and we agreed. And I told Cheryl, I said, "I just got a text message from Rick Shapiro. He wants to do lunch. Maybe he wants me to be on some committee or something." I was foolish. So it began. Rick tells me that he and Nancy are going away on a vacation and need someone to water the plants at their house. He said he had asked Art Katz to do it, but Art was doing fishing excursions somewhere. And then he had asked Lynn Newport to do it, and Lynn said, "I don't know anything about watering plants, but I can wax your car and have the tires changed and things like that." And he didn't feel comfortable watering plants. So it came down to me, number 3. I accepted the request, but Rick insisted that I have to tour his house to see where all the plants were, and he wanted to check my wrist motion on the watering can, and Nancy, you were there sometimes when we did that. And then after 2 tours of the house, he finally certified me to water the plants. And this is the certificate. I will read it to you. It says, "Congratulations. You have successfully completed the plant watering seminar as it pertains to the residents of Rick and Nancy Shapiro. You are now authorized to water the houseplants as directed by Rick Shapiro whenever he and Nancy are out of town for more than 5 days. Here are some tips for maintaining healthy plants. Do not overwater. Water only once per week. Succulents like cactus do not need watering unless we are gone for more than 10 days. On occasion, you may be asked to take Snoops for a walk." Signed, Rick Shapiro. Then he writes a note, a handwritten note. He says, "There is no compensation for this favor other than an occasional treat from Durango, Colorado." And some of you probably know what that means. Rick loved talking about his team, the San Francisco Giants. This, by the way, is his shirt, as well as the Braves, ASU. I got the ASU shirt on. And surprisingly, Maryland Terrapins. That's why we're wearing the hat. and the yarmulke with the Maryland Terrapins on it. He just loved talking about those teams, and but he always got mad at me when I would complain about one of the teams, especially the Braves. And he'd say, "You're not really a fan if you're complaining." I said, "Well, I think that's what a true fan does. A true fan loves his team, but when there's a bad game, you complain about it." He said, "Well, I don't agree with that." He says I should not complain. We never did resolve that issue, by the way. So you might be wondering what these two cups represent. Well, the answer is simple. Rick loved chocolate milkshakes. And these two businesses, in his opinion, had the best to offer. So a lot of times when we would go to lunch, and it was about once a week, every 2 weeks, we'd go and have lunch at the Village Burger up in Alpharetta, or any Mexican restaurant, Chinese Fusion in Dunwoody, and Grubby's New York Deli over by the hospital. So the QT is fairly recent. He loved the QT chocolate shakes, and this was the backup. But he also said that he liked Wendy's and McDonald's too. Although his complaint about Wendy's was that the shakes were too thick. You had to use a spoon to eat them. He called me, another time Rick called me, he said, "Hey, let's do lunch." Now, it reminds me of when my son was young, and he'd call on the phone from somewhere, and he'd say, "Dad," and I'd go, "Max," and we'd talk about, he'd have some question. So I'd get a call from Rick. He says, "Mark, hey, let's do lunch tomorrow." I went, "Great, yeah, I'd love to." So we went and we had lunch, and he starts telling me about this new program that the temple had. And he says, "I've got this great new program, and they give you this fabulous pen, this $5 pen if you join, and you get this really cool little LED flashlight, and they give you a plastic name badge, and you're allowed to donate a percentage of your wealth to the synagogue when it's all over." He says, "This is a great program." So I immediately called Cheryl. I said, "Oh, Cheryl, this is a program we got to join." So if anything, Rick was a fabulous salesman. He could sell anything to anyone, and all you needed was props. But in conclusion, I didn't mean to be too funny here. In conclusion, everyone here is lucky to have known Rick. And I know Rick is with us today and smiling at the beautiful memories we have shared on behalf of my good friend, and I thank you for that. Abe Lincoln once said, "In the end, it's not the years in your life that count, it's the life in your years that really matter." Thank you. Happy trails, Rick.
My name's Lynn Newport, and I was a close friend of Rick. Rick was my confidant, in some respects, my partner in crime, and one of the best people I've ever had the honor to know. It was just after we'd moved to Atlanta in 1994 when I first met Rick at a softball team practice. Then he was the team's captain, and we quickly connected and became fast friends. We shared a love of sports and a desire to have a first-place softball team, something we later finally did. Instead of a standard eulogy, I wanted to use this time to give some of my most cherished memories of Rick. I've intentionally picked the ones that follow as I feel they best represent the type of person Rick was. To start with, there were our conversations when we would both reminisce about our experiences on the West Coast. In particular, we talked about places like San Francisco, LA, and Phoenix, and much of the Salinas and San Joaquin valleys, where Rick, as a boy, spent his time with his father going to melon farms and picking them. Then there were those Shapiro visits to our Hilton Head house. Most of you don't know this, but in Hilton Head I called Rick Ricardo because he was our pool maintenance man. He had to do something to earn his keep, and he would clean out our pool every morning. After that, we'd always take a long bike ride and would later walk on the beach. One of our most cherished memories of Rick and Nancy were the trips our families made together. Some of them were trips to Charleston, to Savannah, and a memorable trip to Santa Fe, New Mexico. It was there we witnessed Rick's love for Mexican food. That's the real Mexican food, not the Americanized stuff. He somehow knew how to find the little out-of-the-way cantina so we could all experience the heartburn of the real thing. As everyone has said, Rick was a sportsman. He cherished all sorts of sports. If it had to do with sports or even sports memorabilia, he relished talking about it. It didn't matter if it was baseball, football, basketball, hockey, golf, or the Olympics. Anything to do with sports he loved. Now back to our softball team days. I played the catcher and harassed the calls of the umpire until I was nearly thrown out of every game. At this moment, Rick became my white knight, and he appeared and he somehow sweet-talked the umpire into leaving me in the game. As he walked past me, he would whisper, "Keep it up." Here's something I found out last year. Rick was a Rolling Stones groupie. He and Nancy went to see the Stones all over the country. He was an encyclopedia, knowing the history of their songs as well as each performer. Last January, Linda and I were lucky enough to go to the Atlanta Stones concert with Rick and Nancy. This turned out to be a very memorable event. Rick as the Temple president and Rick as the Brotherhood president. Rick, along with my wife, Linda, who was the Sisterhood president, somehow managed to book Clark Howard as their Sunday morning gala brunch speaker. I believe that Eric Seidel had a lot to do with putting this together, but somehow he got Clark. All I can tell you was this place was packed, and it was standing room only. He made terrific presidents. Rick is the businessman. Rick had quite a thriving consulting business, and he liked to talk to me about some of his clients. Furthermore, once a month he would drag me to an early morning breakfast lecture where I met some of the movers and shakers of the Atlanta area. Lastly, did you know that Rick and his dog Snoops were hikers? It appeared to me that Rick along on his hikes. Because Snoops was slow, we'd often be at the rear of the pack discussing the results of last night's sports events or sometimes a Temple Emanu-El board meeting. These are just a few of the things I'll always remember about Rick. I know his loss is one that runs deep for many of us gathered here today, but I also know that Rick wouldn't want us to sit around mourning his loss and instead would want us to look forward to the future and think of what we can do to make this world a better place. We'll all miss you, Rick.
Please join me in Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He guideth me in straight paths for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou hast anointed my head with oil, my cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Please rise. Male rachamim, shochem b'amromim, hamedsei menucha nuchona, tachat chanfei hashchina, im kodashim atoharim, Kizohar harakia mazherim, et nishmat David ben Lebel, shehalach le'olamo, Ba'al harachamim, yasti rehe besater kanfav le'olamim, vayitzor betzorcha chaim, et nishmato. Adonai hu nachlato, v'yanuach b'shalom al mishkavo, v'nomar Amen. Compassionate God, eternal Spirit of the universe, grant perfect rest in your sheltering presence to Rick Shapiro, who has entered eternity. O God of mercy, let him find refuge in your eternal presence, in the shadow of your wings, and let his soul be bound up in the bond of everlasting life. God is his inheritance. May he rest in peace. And we say, Amen.